1950s, the post-war. It's still working? Oh, good. Um, so this week we're talking about after World War II. What happened after World War II? Um, World War II ended. We didn't really go much into World War II because it was spring break and you just got Casablanca, and World War II is a lot to go on. One thing that we need to know about how World War II ended was with the dropping of the first atomic bomb, which ushered in a new age of atomic weaponry. The ability to blow up the world. Um, World War One, we had invented all these new ways of killing each other. World War Two took that to an extreme, and all of a sudden, the very real possibility that we could just end life on the planet became a possibility. And so after the war, the United States has gone through a world war. It's gone through a Great Depression. It is now in this new world. It went through genocide, watching the genocide going on in Europe. Um, and now we can blow each other up. And now we've invented this new kind of war, the Cold War. The Cold War is it's cold because it's not a hot war. We're not fighting each other. Where it is a battle of ideologies. It's a battle of both sides. The Soviet Union, the United States, saying we are the best. We should be running the world, and kind of battling not directly against each other, but through proxy wars. The war in Korea, for example, was a war between the two ideologies, but it did not end up with the United States and Russia going to war with each other, which never happens. Throughout the Cold War, Cold War lasts until 1989. Um, and the arms race of nuclear weapons lasts. Well, it's still going on today in a way. We still have nuclear weapons, but that's not. We're not going to talk about that in this week. What we're looking at is what happens after the war. On the one hand, you have the Cold War. On the one hand, you have the battle between ideologies. And here in the States, this gets played out with another Red Scare, just like that Red Scare from the 19 teens with the Palmer raids, and a um, young new, not detective, young new J. Edgar Hoover. What was he back then? He worked with Palmer to arrest immigrants and people suspected of being radicals. And by this point in the 1950s, now Hoover is in charge of the FBI and is searching for communists and people who are suspected to be communists and people who have sympathies for communism. This is a part of a larger issue. And the larger issue is, and here we have to talk about PTSD. Anyone know what PTSD stands for? Post-traumatic stress disorder. After you go through horrible traumatic events, like a hurricane, afterwards you've got this stress from having to live through this difficult time, and you adapt to it in different ways. Some people just kind of shut down and don't do anything. Some people will just go out and do everything that they can. Um, in a way, the United States was suffering from a collective post-traumatic stress disorder after the war, after the Depression. And one of the ways that it responded was everything is okay. We are just so normal. Everything is good. We're just going to buy everything and we are going to be normal. Everything is normal. And you see that in the 1950s with the rise of suburbia. Suburbia, which is small towns that circle a city. I grew up in suburbia in Chicago. Chicago is the main city here, and then all around it there are cities, and people started moving out towards them. um, because they had built the interstate highway system. There were now roads for everyone to drive everywhere, and there were new houses being built. And what's going on? Oh, there we go. Thank you. And there were also things to fill your house with. After World War II, so World War II, what's the United States building? It's building bombers, it's building tanks, it's building guns. It's just like industry is pumping out stuff. Everyone's got a job. After the end of the war, that all stops. Not all of it, but they still build bombers and tanks and guns, but not as many. They're not in a fighting war, and industry just drops. And actually, just last week, the new reports came in about industry, and the drop was the biggest it's been since 1946 for what we're going through right now in coronavirus. And so to reinvigorate the economy, instead of building bombers and tanks and guns, they still started building washing machines and cars and dishwashers and refrigerators and TVs, because now there's TV, and selling it to people. Advertising goes through the roof. There have been advertising for, I want to say forever. That's not true. But there have been advertising for a century. But now, with the combination of television and radio just being everywhere, advertising goes to the roof. People are being sold, buy this, buy this, buy this, and buy. And if you're a good person, you're a normal person, if you buy these things and you have these things. Who are you if you don't have a TV? Who are you if you don't have a washing machine? Oh my goodness, that's crazy. And so this desperate urge to be normal is one of the things that's going on in the 1950s. And one of the ways that it plays out is the paranoia of the Red Scare with McCarthy. McCarthyism, that's going to be on your test for sure, because it's still a phrase that's used today, is when a senator from my great home state of Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, began to produce lists of people. He would go in and he'd say, I have this list here of all the communists that are working in the government. And he never showed anyone the list because there were no names on it. He was just making it up. And it was this wave of fear that really spread, and all kinds of people were called to testify in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. Un-American is still a phrase that gets used today, and it means what you're doing is not American. You're not buying a TV. You're not being normal. You are not buying a new dishwasher and a nice new house in suburbia. What is wrong with you? McCarthy gets taken down eventually. And he gets taken down by this. It's kind of like one of those kind of beautiful moments in history. I'm going to make this big so you can watch it. This is McCarthy testifying, and he is being talked to by, what's his name? Joseph Welch. This is what Joseph Welch has to say to him.
Senator, look, you've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency? As early as 1944.
Have you no sense of decency? At long last, have you no sense of decency? That's pretty much what took him down. It's kind of amazing. McCarthy, had people in fear for years, and finally people stood up and just said, you're kind of a horrible person. And he withered away and disappeared and died from alcohol poisoning soon after. Let's talk a little bit about white flight, because white flight was not mentioned in your book. White flight. What's white flight? White flight was white people leaving cities and moving to suburbia. That big move to suburbia in the 1950s has a lot to do with the civil rights movement. I asked you to watch that video about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. The 1950s are all about being normal, and everything's okay, and everything's fine, but it's not. and the Jim Crow laws are in full effect, and there's a giant movement against them by thousands and thousands of people, including Dr. Martin Luther King, who, by the way, is investigated by J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI in an effort to discredit him. The new laws that are saying, hey, we can't have Jim Crow, you can't have separate but equal, the Brown versus Board of Education, you have to integrate your schools. Schools can't just be for white people in one place and black people in another place. People have to be able to live together. Because of that, lots of white people just said, well, we're moving. We're going to move to the suburb, and only white people are going to live there. So they don't have to see separate equal because they just make their own school systems. And there were laws about where people could live, and there was redlining, which is a way that people who wanted to buy a house, if you were a black person buying a house, there would be actual maps in the banks that had a red line around them. It's like, in this area, you will not allow them to buy the houses. And so suburbia becomes this white enclave. I also ask you to watch a little bit of Lucille Ball. TV is starting in the 1950s. Lucy and Ricky, her husband, and her complaining about her life as a housewife. TV, the sitcom, a comedy, which we still watch today, that's when it's invented. It's invented in the 1950s, and it's kind of the same thing today. It's amazing. That form has really not changed. And in that video, she's complaining about her life as a housewife, and Ricky, of course, is like laughing at her. And then it ends with some advertising showing super happy housewives, just like cleaning the house. They're so happy with their new refrigerator, ecstatically happy about their new dishwasher. This is the 50s, are the beginnings of what's going to be the feminist movement that comes in the late 60s. And this is the first, because everyone is supposed to be normal, being told to be normal all the time kind of drives you a little crazy. And it's the beginnings of the feminist movement that we see here in the 50s. We'll talk about that more as we get to the 70s. I also asked you to watch Muddy Waters singing the great song, The Blues Had a Baby, and they named it Rock and Roll. Rock and roll is alive and well. And I also asked you to watch that thing about comic books. The paranoia in the 1950s was not just about communists. It was about comic books. It was about rock and roll. Rock and roll was considered the devil's music. It was considered the music of juvenile delinquents. Kids listened to this music, they would be led to a life of crime. And so the 1950s is that weird balance of like, we must be normal, we must buy things, and we're going to buy more things, and wanting to be free and wanting to lead the life that you want to live, wanted to dance to rock and roll, wanted to read comic books, wanted to be able to go to a school that was decent, wanted to be able to drink from a water fountain that everyone could drink from. And so there's a lot of tension in the 1950s. At the same time, everyone is happy and normal. Are you normal and happy? Good. Stay that way. All right, I'm going to put together the test. Another simple one. I know I'm going to ask you about McCarthyism. I know that I'm going to ask you about the House Un-American Committee. Un-American, what does it mean to be un-American? And I'm going to ask a little bit about the civil rights movement as well. It wasn't in the book that you were reading. And the Cold War, arms race. In the arms race after after World War II, what was the arms race about? What kind of arms were they trying to build more and more and more of? All right, those are the 1950s. Hail, hail, rock and roll. Deliver us from the days of old. Rock, rock, rock and roll. That's all I can remember. Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry. Listen to some Chuck Berry. Go for it. Oh, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to stop this now.